Hello and welcome to Gothic Reviews. Today we are looking into the Secrets of the Necronomicon, the Necronomicon deck created by the writer Donald Tyson. He is a prolific occultist who writes extensively on different occult systems such as Enochian magic, alchemy, and whatever else, and he is also a fictional writer or contributed to the Cthulhu mythos universe. And now he collaborated with the famous artist Anne Stokes on the construction of this Necronomicon deck. You might know Anne Stokes from the Steampunk Tarot or the Bohemian Gothic or other ones. She always has very nice illustrations that are stark dark. For those of us who like grimmer tones and are inspired by them, this is one of those. And then there is an interesting booklet inside written by Donald Tyson that describes all the Necronomicon cards in detail. And there were several interesting ideas about the Necronomicon that I wanted to share. Even the name itself, the Necronomicon, is kind of fascinating. Nobody really can explain where it comes from. And there are good reasons for that. Most of the inspiration the horror writer H P Lovecraft derived from his dreams. So dreams being what they are, little explained except by those who understand what they symbolize. They often contrive sometimes irreconcilable elements, and this deck in that is very faithful to the original writing of the horror writer Lovecraft, because it also works with several different elements and combines them into a single entity, as you will see when I analyze the major arcana cards and their names. So, the Necronomicon itself, I personally derive it from two sources. Of course, the Necro, everybody knows, it's about death and stuff like that. But the Nomicon part, to me, is more interesting if you view it as a verbal pun and put a G at the beginning of the word Nomicon and read it almost as if it were Gnomicon, except with the G being silent, then you could get a hint to Gnomic verses, which is a type of poetry very popular in medieval times, where they were a type of fictional writing or poetic writing or puzzle writing with hints that people were supposed to decipher, those who knew. And many alchemy texts are written in gnomic verses, and it's an established term known now, and I think Lovecraft himself, being an educated man, was aware of its existence. So he might have, even if he didn't do it consciously, there is no evidence to suggest that that's where he derived it exactly from, but his sources were often as unconscious as his dreams, and that's why his work lives on and is so stimulating for us still, where we get inspired by it every time anew. And to make matters more interesting, the name Necronomicon itself, of the Dread Manual, the dark grimoire written in history, is not the only name that seems to be composite of several elements alien to each other. The other name is of the Necronomicon's author, the fictional author Abdul Alhazred. You can read his name in several various ways, and scholars don't often agree on where to trace it exactly. He's supposed to be Yemenite, and there are no people in the Arabic world of any Arabic country of that time, like 800 years ago or now, that have that precise last name, Al-Hazred. The L particle is widespread. It still shows up and in many Arabic families, but the Hazret part does not. So again, I suspect that it was one of those composite symbols that Lovecraft's dream mind contrived for him, as many dream minds do, out of the conscious elements that we notice all around us. And I suspect that Al-Hazred could be in part read if you remove the H and just treat it as a sequence of letters. then you get the word almost Eliezer, which is the Hebrew variation of the biblical name Lazarus. And the reason that this makes sense to me is because Lazarus was resurrected from the dead, and Necronomicon itself deals a lot with the themes of necromancy, which is also an alternative form of raising the dead, maybe with spells, unlike the Judas miracle workers or whatever, but still, it amounts to the same principle, and for that reason, I think that Alhazred may be read, and this is a valid reading of his name. An alternative way of reading his name could also be with considering several elements of the word, the first part being Oz, and the second part being red, red as in the English word red, for violence, war, military connotations, symbolically speaking, and as a Mesopotamian word, Hebrew, Aramaic, whichever you want to call it, where it means strong and has certain associations with the name of Azazel itself as the chief god creator of the Lovecraftian universe, and also with the word Azazel, but we will touch more in detail on that last one as we discuss the very first card in this deck. And there are other certain names that can be composite that I will discuss in detail as I touch upon the particular cards, but might be interesting to keep in mind that many of the Lovecraftian constructs, and Donald Tyson as the author of this deck remained faithful to that representation, for which I appreciate his work, that it's composite elements working together and creating a new synthetic element that didn't exist before, almost like happens in the worlds of Lovecraft himself with like different metals where they alchemically reduce to some either essential salts, or like he has that theme of alchemy showing up in his fiction a lot with different unknown metals, with metals that are known but reconstructed in different ways. So I don't think it is too far-fetched to remember that he can do the same thing with naming where several elements combine. And without further ado, let us go to the deck itself. There is a little summary of the major arcana that Donald Tyson included, which I really appreciate. It lists all the card names, starting with the Fool being Azazoth and ending with the World being Yig. It lists their numbers, and it lists their associations, such as Moon, Venus, astrological associations, and I like that part. And of course, that kind of correspondence, as is also clarified in the booklet, proves that Donald Tyson tries to preserve the system established by the Golden Dawn tradition, in particular the Rider-Waite deck that we all know and love. And this is the booklet that came with my tarot deck. It describes some of what Lovecraft did. It describes what Donald Tyson added. It also adds more detailed descriptions that maybe can be gleaned from the cards. It also mentions certain other works of Donald Tyson, the author of the deck, that contribute maybe to a fuller understanding. And it seems that he's correct in asserting that a complete understanding could be obtained by reading his additional works about the Necronomicon, because when I just try to deduce certain associations based on the card images themselves, I find myself sometimes confused about some of the associations, which again I will describe more in detail as I touch on each individual major arcana. So this little card comes at the front of the deck and it presents the summary. There's also another card that lists, for those of you who like it, the associations of elements and suits. For me this is less relevant because that's pretty typical, so I don't use that summary as much, but the other summary is very handy, and I'm glad that it was provided to help both like novices and intermediate users, so it was a good touch on behalf of Donald Tyson. So here's how the first card looks. The Fool is Azazoth. You can see him blowing on his pipe. He is very fat. He is interestingly seated in this position where his knees are bent close to his belly. It is in part reminiscent of the Buddha state when you think about it, but of course here Lovecraft has darker connotations for Azazoth, and it is his blind idiot that represents the state of universal chaos, randomness, blind chance in Lovecraftian version. When you think about Azazoth as a name, as I was saying, it is a composite system relating to two different systems. There is a hint of it being part of the Egyptian making with the Thoth ending, and the first part, instead, Aza, is the part that's derived from the Hebrew thinking, which again strongly reminds us of the word Azazel, the demon that was significantly again a god demon when you think about it, and his name means the strong god. Well, there are other interpretations of his name where it's a balance between strong and inexpensive. You might remember him from Supernatural, the TV series, but it is of course a remaking of the original traditional image of Azazel as somebody who signifies a state of sacrifice, possibly relating to a pagan god. There are so many Canaan gods that he could be related to, and he is the one that gives rise to the original concept of scapegoat. So when you look at this first initial card of the Fool, that's all you could keep in mind, and that's just the starting point. That's how beautiful this deck is, where it has so many deep connotations and associations. The Fool also typically represented as a jester, but I think it is a modern misinterpretation of his associations with Saturn. People remember the mythological idea where there are values turned upside down to an extent, and they ascribe it to a court jester that, despite his lowly station, is able to mock the king and his court, and for that reason they call it the Fool, implying the Fool who is the jester fool, not just the mad fool that it was supposed to be originally, the one that doesn't only have associations with Saturn and the values of equality, restoring order, violating order, but also with Dionysus and his divine madness, where the Fool is blessed by the gods with his unusual insights. And it is that kind of a fool that to an extent is the fictional author of the Necronomicon book itself, Abdul al-Hazred. He is also that fool. He works in the dominion of Azazoth. And why is that? It's because he is putting his words into writing, for example, without realizing the implications. That's what the Fool is always famous for. He goes unaware of the danger. He goes and towards the highest potential, and he does not bother with the technicalities of the best way to achieve that potential. He just does what feels good and he's done with it. So, Azazoth, a complex image of setting up the grounds for composite system where the composition is being derived from Hebrew, from Greek, from Roman, from Egyptian system, of course. It's particularly valid to start this deck with an Egyptian-based system because the Egyptians had the idea of composing their gods. They always had those features where they would have the animal head and the human body, and it could signify in many ways how God is hard to perceive, how he has many elements that the human mind cannot understand, which could explain in part why Al-Hazred, the author of the Necronomicon, went mad when trying to perceive his divinities within the Lovecraftian universe. He went mad with his mind, not being able to reconcile what he saw with the naked eye and what he could perceive with the higher senses. And all of those associations are in the Fool card. Then we move on to the Magician card. This is the card dedicated to Nyarlathotep. He is represented in Lovecraftian fiction as a young pharaoh, usually a boy, but he is very intricate in the sense that he has many avatars, and some of them are encountered by the character Randolph Carter in the Dream World, where it's pointed out that if he happened to come across a different incarnation of Nyarlathotep, he would be very, very sorry, and we get an image of incredible power. In some sources, Hotep is described as the ultimate priest. In some sources, he is described as the messenger of the gods. So I think Donald Tyson takes him to be a sort of a hermetic type of figure, where it's the messenger god who also has the wisdom and the magic, maybe combining him with the figure of lore known as Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great mage of the underworld who knows all secrets and such. I don't object entirely to Hotep himself being considered a magician. It seems mythologically, symbolically valid. But I think maybe a different avatar of him should have been chosen for representing the part of the magician. You see, magician, well, you know maybe in many other decks where magician does interact with the outside world and manifest his will into it, where the fool is self-contained, as we saw in the picture of Azazel sitting by himself. Now Hotep here has some kind of a bound figure next to him, sort of supplicant that asks for his favor. So that in itself signifies interaction, which is acceptable. But the way Hotep drains his supplicant is a different take that is in part representative of the Lovecraftian universe with its grimmer vision, how the elder gods, the darker powers, have dominion over men. That is acceptable, but to place him as a magician might not necessarily be the best of choices, at least this version, because of how thoroughly he drains it. That aspect is not always present in the magician card. You usually see how the magician manifests his will, usually with a bolt of power, some magical symbol, his control over the elements, but his control is just interactive, assertive, and it does not fully control the environment around him. I think this mask of Hotep might be too powerful for the card of the magician. It's above and beyond our comprehension, and other older gods, other deities might have been more appropriate. I understand why Tyson did what he did, because he was thinking this is like a Hermes figure and who is better to represent magic. It's all true. It's not that I have an issue with the concept, it's that particular specific application that I wonder about. But at the same time, as always, Anne Stokes delivers here a beautiful rendition where you see that cowled figure, you see the starry sky. It all has this eerie connotation that is representative of Lovecraftian fiction, where you don't know if you're dealing with science, magic, you're supposed to think you're dealing with both. It's true, there are aliens all around you that you cannot see. It's all of those hints of horror. I must say that Hotep reminds me a lot of the Stephen King character in the beginning of Dark Tower, where, you know, Roland is following this tall figure, hooded, robed, and it turns out to be the servant of, well, I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't read Dark Tower, but it would be typical of Stephen King because he paid homage to Lovecraft more than once with Needful Things and other works. So I think it is valid to remember Hotep as being portrayed in his character that was the main antagonist of the series to a degree. There are other forces, but they're more behind the scenes, and this one is the one that everybody sees. And I think that's how I see Hotep himself, where he is behind the scenes. He has many servants. He is the main power. He represents other gods himself, maybe, just like Hermes, who taught people how to worship, and Hermes' predecessor, in part Prometheus, taught people how to make sacrifices. That's what Hotep does for the elder gods, but he's always a power unto his own, and all we see of the outer gods, other than glimpses of their power, is through his face. He is our gate to understanding them, and that's why he is their messenger god. Also, the name Hotep is again interesting in that it follows that principle of composition I mentioned before. His very name can be divided into several parts. The final part of it, Hotep, might be referring to Imhotep, a famous general pharaoh of the 18th dynasty in Egypt. And the first part might refer, being N, refers maybe to the famous pharaoh who was one of the first to try and reunite the whole of Egypt, Narmer, who is famous for the Narmer palette in art. So I think both of them are borrowed from the Egyptian world, and they to some degree might be said to represent the beginning of Egypt's greatness as well as the beginning of its decline into obscurity, and all those elements are always present in Lovecraftian universe, where there are cycles of decay, cycles of expansion. Even the great gods have to wait for their power to wake up. And especially it was relevant for the Fool, which starts ordering right after the chaos represented by the World card has been unleashed. So all of those connotations you could keep in mind when you're thinking Nar-el-Hotep. Our next major arcana is appropriately the High Priestess. Here she is represented by the figure of the Egyptian goddess Bast. It seems to be kind of appropriate. She had major worship in Egypt, and she was not the supreme deity herself at any point, but she was always one of the main ones, so that seems a good choice for if Lovecraft chose her. I could see that, so Tyson did well in choosing her too. Whether or not he covered her independently in his fiction, I'm not sure, but I think her choice as the High Priestess of the gods seems to be appropriate. Here she is featured with 3 cats. There is 1 black, 1 white, and 1 gray. As always, the black and the white, that's kind of typical for the High Priestess image, where she's divided between 2 pillars. Usually they speak of the division between the mundane world and the higher world. And here it's a nice touch where the gray cat in her lap represents a synthetic approach again, which is appropriate for an Egyptian goddess. But it's also appropriate for a High Priestess who's supposed to find that middle ground between the teachings of above and the teachings of below. And here that balance is further enhanced by the presentation of Bast first as a human representative and followed by a high statue of herself entirely in a cat form, as almost one could say that it's like her representing the highest version of herself, which is basically what many high priests are supposed to be doing when they are possessed by the spirit of the god. They represent that god. And sometimes in modern New Age circles we could say that like they channel themselves or the highest self or whatever else. But it's always the same principle, whether it's a god or the self, where the human is somewhat limited, and here we see that she only has the cat head here and the human body, where the unlimited potential is represented by the divine, and they have to be reconciled. The limitations of the human body allow only so much channeling of the highest power, and that's how things are technically supposed to be. And then there are the half moons on the throne behind Bastet, which is appropriate, with the moon representing the unconscious powers of the mind, and it is the channel through which this High Priestess, the human part of her, is able to sense the higher influences. So I really like that image, as I like many of them, but I do like this one too. Then we're moving on to the Empress, as is typical of the Rider-Waite deck. Here she is represented by the elder goddess Shab-Niggurath. A very interesting name, really. There were many attempts to identify it. One of them ties her somewhat appropriately, somewhat not, to the Hebrew word for Saturn, Shabtai. When you think about it, Shab and Shab, the first part of her name seems to resonate with the word for Saturn. And she might be related to Saturn, I think, but indirectly. It is in the sense of the astrological affiliation between Saturn and Venus, their secret marriage, if you remember from mythology, represented by Hephaestus having an affair with Aphrodite and such, and she was cheating on him with Ares, and you know that myth where he would entrap her. and such. So there is a connection between them, and the myth represents the astrological affiliation. So in that, Shab-Niggurath might be indirectly representative of Saturn. It's very intricate here because we'll hear later on how she might be that unmentionable lover of the god Ygg, who is representative of Saturn. So it all makes sense to me. It's one of the connections. The other connection some scholars of Lovecraft traced is to a prior concept established by an author that inspired Lovecraft, and he had this concept of Sheol Neginoth, based on two Hebrew words. Sheol means, well, some people interpret it nowadays as hell, but in truth it always meant more of an underworld instead of an actual hell, in the sense of that you understand as the hell dimension, one where you get punishment. That is not the kind of implication that was there. The other part of that word Neginoth had to do with music, so it could be translated as the melodious underworld in part. And it sounds interesting in itself for all of its implications, because as you can see, this goddess Shab-Niggurath has goat horns, so she has those features that one would associate with the demon, so it seems tempting to place her there in the underworld. That's where she belongs. But as always, Lovecraftian gods are more complex than that. They never really fit neatly into any single category. They defy the mind, they drive people mad, as Abdul Al-Hazred could tell you. And because of that, she has also other elements to her name. I think that Lovecraft did well renaming her, and in a sense the N sound sounds more melodious and gentle, and he renamed her into Shab-Niggurath from Neginoth, if that is the case. And I think he made it sounding more sinister, in part that wrath part. It sort of reminds me of how his Lovecraft's old friend and colleague Robert E. Howard, the author of Conan the Barbarian, named his gods. They were inspiring each other, and the author of Conan was in Lovecraft's circle. So he made the most sinister of all antagonists, I think, at least in the cartoon, they named him Rothamon, but I think that might have been what his name really was. And that Roth part, it always sounds of those associations. It reminds me of wrath on one part as anger, as the English word, and on the other hand, perhaps it reminds me a little bit of the god Ra in his dire aspect when he is enraged, and you never want to enrage the Egyptian sun god. So all of those sinister associations are neatly conveyed by just altering slightly the ending of Shab or Sheol Neginoth to Shab-Niggurath. And I think if Lovecraft did do that, consciously or not, that was a brilliant stroke on his part. It made her an entirely independent goddess. And now Tyson portrays her really well. She is here the mother figure who steps on her own goatling children. And it's kind of interesting again because obviously it's a play here verbally on the Egyptian mythology, but semantically the Egyptian goddess Isis and Nut were both known for being the protective mothers. But you see, Egyptian ideal of protecting your children is slightly different than the one that you have in modern understanding. The way they protect you is by pecking at you, biting you, hurting you, so that you become stronger. That's what we get from the Egyptian Book of the Dead and other sources, where the goddesses are supposed to be benevolent, and it's all nice and good, but they can occasionally break your bones for all of their benevolence at your own behest, for your own greater good type of thing. So with that in mind, now dawns the new understanding of Shab-Niggurath as the one who steps on the skulls of her own children. She seems very appropriate here as the mother figure. She's fertile, which was an aspect of Isis, of course, as you remember. And in that she connects in part to the previous card of Bast, because Bast has the foundation of Ast, and that is not a random analysis, it's just that the Egyptians pronounced Isis as Ast. So Bast was eventually incorporated as one of the aspects of Isis. Everybody was incorporated, every female goddess, into an aspect of Isis at some point, but Bast actually has linguistic associations with Isis. Isis is the Greek name given by Plutarch or Herodotus to her, but her Egyptian name was Ast, in our transliteration. So Bast has that memory. So why is that all connecting? Well, because Bast had the Isis element in her as part of her, as an implied but not explicit part of her. And here we have the following card having a full Isis image. Shab-Niggurath is Isis incarnate in part. She is the assistant of her children. She might not do it in the way that you would expect a mother to do, but she still tries her best. And her portrayal is balanced here. She has the skull in one hand, the noose in another. If you think that it's dire and diabolical, tarot images often contain such mystical elements, and here it's just another regular, almost for Lovecraftian universe, mundane balance between death and higher faculties, between life and death, between love and lust, between actualization and potential. None of them are as evident as they are in the image of Shab-Niggurath, that herself becomes drawn to different gods in her search for fertility, and is trying to bring as many little kid demons as she can, while at the same time destroying them. So there is an element of control, like I brought you into this world, I can destroy you type of thing that you're familiar with maybe from all kinds of like movies, or if not personal life. And then she has several breasts. Her very posture is also very interesting. It almost seems like stuck in a dancing position. She is basically dancing on skulls, and she's holding a noose. To lovers of mythology, that could be a telltale sign, the memory of Kali. Because that's how she's often portrayed. She has several of something, it happens to be hands instead of breasts, but you get the principle. So Shab-Niggurath is a collective image. She has Isis, she has Kali, she has other goddesses as well, goddesses of fertility, goddesses of war, goddesses that are mother, like not vulture elements, where the vulture is supposed to peck at its young while protecting them, maybe even a serpent goddess. And a serpent goddess was supposed to be protective in Egypt, sometimes in Greece too, but mainly in Egypt. And it's interesting because many of those associations tie her to her presumed partner. It was never proven, but it is assumed by many scholars that Shab-Niggurath is connected to the serpent god Yig, the lord of Saturn. So those associations are the ones to keep in mind when thinking of Shab-Niggurath. Now we're moving to the Empress common consort, the Emperor. Here he is represented by the god Ammon. And here I think it may be one of Tyson's maybe inaccuracies. I don't want to say bad things about Tyson because like he did so well in all the other cards. It doesn't seem likely for Ammon to be there. Ammon never really functions that much in the Lovecraftian universe. He shows up, he is occasionally maybe hinted at in different Egyptian-like stories by Lovecraft or his followers. And even though he was a major god within Egypt itself, and his practice became significant enough to the point of him being conflated with the god Ra, where we know them as Amun-Ra and stuff, but it wasn't ever explicit enough in Lovecraft. And here, if Anne Stokes was accurate in her rendition of what Tyson had in mind, then he doesn't seem all that powerful. You see his curved horns, you see his lithe body, but he has no other godlike attributes. I think even Nar-El-Hotep seems more powerful than him. I would not consider him worthy of the role of the emperor, honestly. Even though he did have good functions in the Egyptian pantheon, he had the south wind, possible associations of oracles, divination, maybe healing, maybe he might have inspired the idea of loyalty, the bonds of loyalty and faithfulness, similar to the god Mithras. He might have had some mystery schools. He might have been considered at some point to be the god of wealth, because he would bring the change in the desert with his south wind. So there were many benign functions with many important roles as the god of war, as the god of strength, and he could be admired for many things by his followers, but none of these functions appear to come largely in Lovecraft's own stories. He never capitalized on those. He wrote about other Egyptian things like Sphinx and Mummy and whatever else, but his only version of Ammon, I think, shows up as Ammon Logoth or something like that, or Gorloth rather, which seems more appropriately his, where it's a composite image. Ammon by himself is just not strong enough to pull off the mask of the Emperor. I don't see that. I could see the Emperor being Cthulhu. I could see the Emperor being Nodens. I don't see Ammon as the Emperor. He is too young. He doesn't come across as a consort of the goddess Shub-Niggurath. He seems kind of like a boy to her mature femininity, honestly. So that is the only disappointment conceptually that I have. Graphically, it's still appealing, it's still interesting, but it has less things going on than others. Maybe in Donald Tyson's story there's an explanation why Ammon is given such a position as the Emperor, but I think until I read it I might disagree with that one. Ammon's successor is the god Dagon, the Hierophant. He is very interesting. The very word Hierophant is actually interesting. It is also comprised of two parts. The Greek words meaning to lead, hara, to be holy, to lead towards holiness, and phant from the Greek word panos, face. So he is in a sense the leader, that through him you get a glimpse of the otherness, of alienness, and he couldn't be more alien than that. He has a dolphin head, a single eye, he has webbed feet, claws, he is enormous. He is a very nice fish-like representation of an elder god, entirely apt, entirely suitable. His name is, of course, based on the historical, mythological god Dagon. Some pronounce it as Dagon. Linguists are divided whether he is a grain god or whether he is a fisher god. The older generation of linguists consider him to be a fisher god that comes across from the sea to benefit those who worship him. And later he acquired associations, but I think some of the linguists that wanted to tie him too much with Saturn might be incorrect. They were working on a corrupt translation of the Baal epic, and I don't think that they got the gist of him entirely correct. I think his water associations point to other more valid connections, but that's a story for another time. The point is that he is worthy of being a representative. In Lovecraftian stories, you see him as the leader of many implied cults, as a major power, as the one whose very children and their little secrecy drives people mad and changes society. So he is very worthy to be a Hierophant. It was a very good choice. His association with Taurus constellation is a little bit more puzzling for me. The only thing I can come up with when I think about it is that the myth of Taurus, the Greek variation started with a bull being sent to King Minos by the Lord of the Sea Poseidon. So if that is Tyson's idea of tying it to Taurus, I suppose, and he rightfully notices that even though elder gods are in the sea, they're just constrained by the sea, they might be actually of the earth material. I understand that, and Taurus is supposed to be about earth. But it still seems a little bit far-fetched in that regard. I see why he is the Hierophant. I don't see why he represents the Taurus constellation personally. Maybe somebody can, and you can leave a comment to that effect. I would love to hear your thoughts. but I don't see him as Taurus. Then this card of the Lovers, it's very interesting. Normally we see the sixth card being lovers, but they seem to be engaged in an interaction usually. And sometimes in the Gothic variations of lovers, I notice where one side seems to be dominating of the other, sometimes with sinister, dark implications. Here it's almost like a combination of both. The partners appear to be equal. We see a human bride, we see a frog-like deep one who is altered. I think this one might be part of the story that Donald Tyson was writing in his other books, and it is intriguing. I would love to read them. But here we see those partners being equal. We don't see... The deep one doesn't seem to be really diabolical. His eyes speak of wisdom to me, and I would trust him to be the kind of nice, benign elder that actually maybe benefits human civilization rather than has ideas of how to use us, rape us, or teach us how to hate everything or anything like that, like some other dark entities of Cthulhu universe. So he is a deep one. And it's funny that he is a deep one because the deep ones are supposed to be under the dominion of Dagon, whom we have seen earlier. So keep in mind such gentle, subtle connections between the cards when you do a reading. In that, Tyson shows us how one may be connected to the other. There is a subtle thread coming through in different ways, either in sequence or in different numbers connecting to each other, but I will expound more on that later. But for now, we can see that they are equal, they are reunited. The wedding ceremony, that's, in a sense, it's less typical for the lover card. The traditional Rider-Waite deck has the lovers joined, they are interacting, but they are not at the stage of marriage, because marriage signifies too much of a deep commitment, and sometimes love can be, or needs to be even, unrestrained. In a sense, though, the Gothic ideas that have changed the interpretation of this card are valid. They might be based on the reinterpretation of the myth of Gemini with Castor and Pollux, one of them being more dominant than the other because he was a demigod, the other being only more mortal type of thing. So one of them, like here the deep one, has more power. But he's not using his power for evil, and in the original myth, the twins, Castor and Pollux, were always united. They were well balanced. One was a boxer, so the more aggressive one. One was a tamer of horses, so the more restraining one. There is a need for both action and restraint at different points of time, and the lovers represent this kind of balance. So here, the deep one and his bride also represent that kind of balance, but in other areas, I guess the bride is here the receptive one, being female. We have those sometimes unfair and entirely wrong ideas, but symbolically they might be accurate here, of the wife as being slightly passive or receptive and the husband be more active. In actuality, I think here the husband even is not, or the husband-to-be, because it's still a wedding ceremony, the husband is not really that active. He seems very collected, very peaceful. He doesn't seem like the traditional aggressive male-dominant part. He's not stuck in the midst of motion as in many other tarot decks with lover cards represented. So I think that they are here more perfectly balanced, that maybe this rendition of the lover's card, the Gothic version, is more accurate for the constellation of Gemini than many others. And I like this card better than many other lover cards I've seen before, even in the traditional Rider-Waite decks. And then we have, again, another traditional card of the Chariot. Normally on the Chariot card in the Rider-Waite deck, we see two opposing forces. We see a chariot driven by two mounts of some kind. Sometimes they are horses, but not always. Sometimes they are fantastical creatures, like griffins, like dragons. All of those have been known in mythology and would be accurate. Here is a very nice rendition of the Chariot with the Beast of Babylon and many sprouting heads. It is in part reminiscent of the Hydra. So at first I didn't see the association that Tyson drew here with the typical motif of the balance of movement, but now I understand that the balance is between the nature of the heads. Some of the heads here, exactly half of them are female, and some of them are entirely male. So it's that opposition between male and female here that lasts from the balance of the previous card that represents the true motif of the Chariot card. Also, the story of this interesting wizard guy Balaka is mentioned in the booklet I've shown you before, written by Donald Tyson himself, where he is a wizard of Babylon and can occasionally manifest on different necks and has the most control on top of the beast, even though he still has no control, probably not as much as he hoped at any rate. And this story to me was the clinching motif. Yes, that does speak of the balance of the Chariot. The Chariot can often be thought of, if you remember classical myths, it is the story of Phaeton who wants to reach for the stars, but is unable to truly use his heritage when his father Helios gives him the carriage, the Chariot. He is not able to control it. And it's that thin balance between reaching for control and being able to have it is that the Chariot is often about, and here the beast and this specific wizard is also about that. So it's entirely suitable. It's a good Lovecraftian motif, a good retelling. I totally love it. As you probably expected, I know I certainly did, the next card, the typical strength, is represented by Shoggoth. Shoggoth are, of course, those beings of power from the Lovecraftian universe that were made as servants. They are alien-like but have immense power. The idea behind them was to utilize brute power to accomplish great deeds. So if somebody wants to build a pyramid, for example, not that it was stated explicitly, but if they did, they would bring a little army of Shoggoth, and the Shoggoth would just leave the blocks, thus explaining all the mystery of how it was done with the insufficient tools. So the Shoggoth were built by some elder races, and here it is a very good incorporation to the Lovecraftian universe of the traditional idea of strength, because even in traditional decks it's not always accurately shown that it's between strength and power. True power is the ability to know where you direct your strength. Strength is but a resource that allows you to go after your true intention, to achieve your goal, to achieve it in the right way. And if you veer off, you might get too corrupt in your utilization of strength. And that's in a sense what happened in the Lovecraftian universe, where the Shoggoth rebelled against their master. And the balance between strength and power is shown here when the Shoggoth is guided by the higher being that created it, an elder thing, the Crinius race of aliens that controlled the universe eons ago. So here we see that thing on top, and that's why it represents true power. And here the Shoggoth is carrying under the direction of the true power, and it is using physical strength. And physical strength is again just one attribute of power. In traditional decks, we often could see a lion representing the brutal strength, and a young girl who has all the power. She's the one that's able to tame the lion. She's the one able to soothe its gentle feelings. So she is the true power behind the strength, and it seems like very unlikely that somebody like a youthful maiden would be able to control such a savage beast, but that's the entire association, the relation between power and strength. Power does not have to look intimidating, it just gets things done, it's efficient. And that's what that elder thing here in the Lovecraftian version of the same card is doing, where it's using a tool. It looks much smaller than the Shoggoth, but it only makes sense. A powerful being could be weaker physically and use somebody imposing and strong at its service, and that's what we see here. And that's an entirely brilliant rendition by both Stokes and Tyson of the traditional relationship between power and strength. And here we continue with another traditional card of the Hermit. Appropriately chosen, we have the witch Ithaqua. The name speaks of certain Native American motifs. I think Lovecraft was aware of several of them and was trying to imitate them. After all, his serpent god Yig is an obvious borrowing from the rainbow serpent. But here, Ithaqua, as interpreted by Tyson, might be slightly less familiar to you than the Ithaqua that you remember from Lovecraft and his followers. At least it was for me, because I remember the Ithaqua as that monster that is the mother of all the Wendigo, the god, Yeti god of the Native Americans. I thought that was the Lovecraftian version, but I'm not sure anymore, because it seems like Tyson is making her to be slightly different, sort of isolated witch that's working for Nyarlathotep. And here she is by herself, as the Hermit is supposed to be. She is leaning over fire. In a sense, she is the opposition to the Fool. The Fool is also well balanced within himself, pursues inner knowledge, and so does the Hermit. The Hermit approaches it in a more conscious, orderly manner. The Hermit knows what he's looking for, and the Fool is not aware of what he's looking for. That's the crucial difference. But here we see, in a sense, the Fool being transformed into the wiser Hermit. The Hermit is still by himself, still interacts only with himself and his parts of himself. Here we see the witch scrying over the fire. We see the skulls around her, the skulls possibly symbolizing old knowledge of old experience. In Lovecraftian variation, it definitely does, because skulls with necromantic powers provide knowledge. They can be summoned, they can be forced to share their secrets, whether they like to or not. And Ithaqua, being a ginormous witch, is definitely able to force anybody to do almost anything, except perhaps for Nyarlathotep, who never comes to her, and that's why she keeps being alone, but she doesn't mind. She's used to it. As can be seen by her old age, she's stooped by the age. Her back is bent a little, but she doesn't really seem infirm to me. She seems evil. A little bit reminiscent of the Stephen King version of the Wicked Witch of the West, if you remember the Rhea of Kos character. That's what I think of when I see Ithaqua. I think they might be both based on a similar archetype of the witch. At least, to my mind, they are firmly connected in their powers, in their attitudes of evilness and wickedness, and isolation from the outside world. That other witch was also all by herself, like a hermit, and would use the powers she obtained for evil. And now we're moving to the card of the Wheel, and here we see finally the elder god we all know and love, Yog-Sothoth. You might remember him from Stephen King's Needful Things, where he was briefly mentioned and slightly perhaps reinterpreted if we are to take Leland Gund as his direct avatar, or at least maybe Gund was supposed to be instead one of his minions, which would be appropriate because Yog-Sothoth is the gateway, the beginning and the end of all, as we know from Lovecraft. The wheel is usually, on the traditional decks, it shows the forces of nature being at bay, being at balance, divided evenly between two opposing powers. Sometimes those powers are represented by crawling little dragonlings or wyverns on top of the wheel, which can pull it this way or the other. Here, we don't see any wheel, but to make matters very interesting, we see Stonehenge and an altar of sacrifice. So, to my mind at least, this is a slightly different interpretation of the wheel. The wheel is usually a sort of unconscious movement which can move in your favor or against your favor, as represented by Lady Fortune of the Roman religion. But here instead, or Fortuna shows called, here it's something different. Here we see a consciously contrived process to control the powers of fate in your favor. The magician, or the druid if you will, is casting a spell over the body of a sacrifice. He is in control of that spell, or so he thinks, and it is his intention to summon Yog-Sothoth, or so he thinks, because if Yog-Sothoth is so powerful, maybe he can contrive certain ways for you to summon him, whether you really need to or not. And Yog-Sothoth has the power to transfer his brethren, the elder gods, through a portal, and he needs more portals to be open, which is presumably why he is able to interact with humans and to accede to their wishes. Here, Yog-Sothoth is presented in a very interesting way as a sort of quasi-geometrical pattern. You would notice that it has certain little round balls that I would consider to be bubbles. In my mind, they are the direct connection of his lineage of Yog-Sothoth being traceable back to the full god Azathoth at the center of madness, where, because there are bubbles coming from his court, and those bubbles become real and they pop, and there are all kinds of things. You probably remember him from the Lovecraftian writing that describes it well. And the reason I think that Yog-Sothoth might be connected to Azathoth is because Azathoth is the supreme ruler, and Yog-Sothoth is the means by which the evilness and madness of Azathoth can spread. And equally significant is the linguistic tie, because Yog-Sothoth has that element of th or oth at the end, where Azathoth has the same element. Both of them are derived from the Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, or in its Bedouin or otherwise interpretation, Tehuti or Diahuti, depending on how you pronounce your consonants. Most of them would be more throaty consonants, by the way, which is part of why the Egyptian pantheon, again, would be very suitable. It's those throaty consonants that in our mind, those Semitic languages represent sometimes the dark wizardry and forces and summoning spells. The way they pronounce it, they sound less intelligible, more alien, and more suitable for the Lovecraftian universe. Here, other than the bubbles, Yog-Sothoth is represented also by this maybe triangular type of shape. To me, it looks like a reverse triangle, and it reminds me of the element of air represented in alchemy by a similar triangle. I don't know if it is an intentional imitation or just a sort of unintended representation, because Yog-Sothoth was always unintelligible and represented by some geometry that the mind could barely comprehend. So it seems fitting for many representations of him, but I find this one a good one because it manifests through the air. He might use the air as a medium to open the portal, so it sort of makes sense to me that even if it wasn't intended, it could still work for associations. That's how many cards in a tarot deck work in any tarot deck, where certain associations not intended by the artist would still work in your favor when you interpret them as a reader, because they make sense to you and you make them more intelligible, and they do work as part of the greater picture that the artist did intend. And do I accept Yog-Sothoth as the wheel? I'm not sure. The thing is that Yog-Sothoth is often summoned, but he doesn't seem to rule the fates of men. He definitely has lots of power, he definitely has lots of knowledge, and he is one that is more benign than others. But is he that kind of a power that is the power of fortune? I think, to my mind, Azathoth could combine that role along with maybe the role of the fool. I think he might have some of both. Yog-Sothoth is a different entity, so it is tempting to place him at the wheel, but I'm not sure if I follow this precisely based on all the logical precedents of the Rider-Waite deck. I'm not sure if this is entirely accurate, but maybe the retelling by Donald Tyson and his other works might shed more light on it. Our next card is Justice. Again, that is a traditional card association in Rider-Waite decks. And here we see the spawn of Cthulhu being imprisoned in a cage. Interestingly enough, as mentioned in the booklet by Tyson, those who crafted the cage themselves are already long dead, where the spawn survives, to an extent that represents very admirably the theme of justice as is portrayed in the Rider-Waite deck, because justice cannot be done by others to you, it cannot be allowed, it cannot be forced. Justice is something that comes in part from the inside, and sometimes you see this interesting balance, like in some animal decks, there are elephants that blindly rush at you on the card of justice, because it shows how justice can get out of control, it can become a part of captivity, is this here, it can become a part of empowerment when you are getting to be in charge and become the power to its strengths. It's always about the individual allowing themselves their own type of justice, their own type of memory. The spawn, in a sense, represents the idea that we can be bound by our memories of injustice. We are in a cage contrived by others. They did it to us, but we carry on that motif. It's especially true probably in all the cases of trauma and abuse, and where it carries on after its perpetrators are gone because our mind reproduces it. And that's how the spawn is stuck in the cage. The spawn is very powerful. It could escape the cage if it had all of itself, or if it had its higher faculty, the Daddy Cthulhu, to be able to release it. And that's what we all need. If we rely on our higher faculties in our search for justice, we can release ourselves from this cage of slavery. And if we don't, we remain captured long after the deed that gave us injustice was done. So it's a beautiful message, and it's really beautifully done in Gothic colors, and I wholly endorse it. I follow all of the connections and I agree with them. On card number 12, we have the Hanged Man, which is traditional. Normally we see some variation of hanging being done. We see a person turned upside down, hanging by its heel. We could see a bat in animal decks hanging in its natural position, upside down. We can see other creatures thrown about. It usually has some kind of a reversal aspect, because we are always forced to see something from a different perspective, something we did not anticipate. Here, we do not see any such thing, or at least I do not observe any hanging done. If you notice any kind of hint here, do let me know if you can interpret it as hanging. All I see is the balance of the two angels on a treasure chest here, which is appropriate because the Hanged Man is always card number 12, and 12 has 2 in it, so numerologically 2 would be incorporated into its power, and that's what we see with the angel. There's also another 2 where the guardian of that well of the seraph is facing its Arabic victim. They're facing each other, where one of them is on top, the other is underneath. So in that, there is that aspect of the hanging where somebody, even if your higher self, as in the case of Odin on the tree, put you there for the sake of greater glory. In this case, in a typical Lovecraftian fashion, there is this Arab who is not aware of the consequences. He does something incredibly stupid by magical standards or cult practices. He loses track, and then he gets entrapped by his own deeds. It's a very typical motif for this universe. I like it. The Arab had to learn things the hard way through a type of self-sacrifice. He's not going to benefit from this knowledge, though. That's the main difference and distinction between this Lovecraftian deck, and others that are less gothic and more straightforward rider weight decks, where normally whoever makes the sacrifice, even if somebody makes it on their behalf and forces them into it, or if they do it on their own, they're able to benefit. They can get the insight that they need. Here, whatever insight this poor victim of his own actions would get would be an insight he is not able to use because he's trapped in that well forever. I like several things about this card. It seems typically Lovecraftian, so suitable. It represents a well, which is a motif in Lovecraftian other stories where the well is poison. The well seems to give, well takes, and that seems to be wise to include it as a theme of sacrifice, because you sacrifice something so that you can get something in return. That is an appropriate hangman association. Also, the guardian of the well here has serpentine qualities of fire. If you wonder about that aspect, that is because it's supposed to be Lovecraftian-like seraph, and you might know seraph as a type of a burning type of angel, but in actuality there were many other types of that in Jewish and otherwise folklore, where they were winged serpents, firing, invisible serpents type of things. They always had those serpentine or draconine associations, perhaps, where they could sometimes be invisible, sometimes angelic, but not always. Often enough, they were considered to be abominations once, and Moses had certain unpleasant interactions with them. So the seraph is appropriate for recreating a Lovecraftian motif because it's reinterpreted here as the guardian of the well. The poisoning of the well seems to be a good motif in its own. It features in several magical tales where a certain creature would poison a well and then a hero would come to release it. Here, the anti-hero comes to release a treasure instead of benefit humanity and gets punished for his hubris, which is also appropriate for Lovecraft. And what else? The well is often has astrological connotations. You would notice that Jacob chooses his bride by the fact that she gives him some water from the well. That is not at all accidental and a biblical whimsy. It's based on long-established astrological standards that have to do with both the Virgo constellation and the Aquarius constellation. It's evenly divided between them for different reasons, and I could just make an hour-long video just on that, so I won't bother. If somebody cares about that, leave a comment and I will make a follow-up video on mythological motifs. But there's a lot of connotations in here, and they're all fascinating and apt. And of course, the hangman is followed by the traditional death. Many of you who are not experienced in tarot readings always ask me about the frightening elements of the death card. Even the most traditional of all the death cards always have those scary images where it's easy to imagine, if you don't know how to read symbols, that something dreadful is happening. But in actuality, death is always more about a certain transformation, or at least about where you feel like you are dead, or part of you did die, or somebody dear to you died, but in actuality you're still very much alive, breathing, and whoever is around you as well. But you don't come out maybe the same, you come out a little bit changed from that experience that's symbolized by the death card. And that's true for all the death cards I've ever seen, and I've seen maybe thousands, or maybe more probably by now. Now here, the Lovecraftian version of death is given by Tsotsogo. You would notice again the ending reminiscent of some of the Alan Gwyn Native American legends. That's not accidental. Lovecraft was well read for his time in all kinds of science, history, mythology. Not so much the occult, to your surprise probably, but I know I was surprised by that, but started picking up those bits too, but he definitely knew enough legends to suit anybody. So he, even if he didn't intend those hints at the Native American ideas, they certainly come through a lot. Them and the Aztec tales of the Popol, or later published as Popol at least. So here, Tsotsago, you might remember him. He was a memorable god because another civilization discovered him as the frog god and realized that his those who displeased him were transformed into mist-like creatures, and some of them were serpentine looking, and he had the immense power of transformation, which is very appropriate for death. At first I was thinking that, I don't know, maybe he's too insignificant for death, but when I think about the transformative powers, then it becomes to make more sense. Also remember that death is card number 13. As such, numerologically it has the influence of both 1 and 3 in it, so see if you can tie it up to card number 1, the Magician, card number 3, the Empress, and what you make of it. Make it a home exercise. It would be very profitable for your experience as a card reader. In the meantime, the one hint I could give you would be that he does tie up in a sense to Nyarlathotep's magic. He also uses victims in a similar way. You can see these victims strung up, horribly transformed to the pole, and you would remember how Nyarlathotep, the hooded magician, Hermes-like god, exhausted the power of the skull, the skeleton in front of him as well, and transformed it with his magical powers into something else. None of those connections are accidental. If you think that most things are accidental in tarot decks, you would find yourself wrong, just as if you think that everything is meaningful, you would find yourself wrong. But many things in tarot associations are correct when you just get them from somewhere, you don't know from where. That's usually your instinctive knowledge speaking, and you should listen to it. And this is the death card, Tsotsago. He is a very interesting god. He seems to have some benign elements, or at least negotiable, mutable elements, but he is terrible in his wrath, which is something you might expect from Grim Reaper-like figures. So upon second considerations, I don't have as much problem as it. I expected maybe more of a death punch from a Lovecraftian deity on a Lovecraftian deck, but when I think of the transformation power, then I guess it does make sense. And then we have the reanimators symbolizing temperance. As a numerological connection, it is worth noticing that this is card number 14. So again, it has both 1 and 4 in it, and 1 connects it to Nyarlathotep, and you would notice that one of the 3 figures standing here is also hooded. It's a minion of Nyarlathotep himself, but he uses the knowledge obtained in the service of Nyarlathotep towards his own benefits. And then there is a balance between 2 servitors of his who enact his spell. And this is a slightly different maybe take on temperance. Temperance used to be one of the virtues considered in medieval times to be worthy enough to be singled out as one of the supreme virtues for Christian people of the time. And it was supposed to signify your strength in the face of obstacles, and that's how many traditional decks depict it, with the idea that there is some kind of a liquid, and that is the power of your emotions trying to tempt you, and you are trying to be thrown in the face of it. But usually it's an interaction between lesser cast of characters. You would see 1 or 2 at most in front of a liquid, and they are the ones that balance each other, the person and the emotions. Here, it's slightly different because there is no such temptation. There's only the minions of the Dark One who has the knowledge. There is the liquid in the cauldron that is presumably a reviving balm of some kind. So here you should probably interpret this card in a way radically different from the one you would interpret it normally. Instead of regular temperance, this is a kind of aspect of reunion with something that you may have lost, and it connects to the last card, death, because death allows you to lose something that you might have considered part of yourself. Here you are able to bring it back to life, and I think this is unique for this specific deck, and I like it a lot. Usually that kind of a reunion is only hinted at the Lovers card number 6 that we have seen, some kind of a reunion with what you lost, even in other Necronomicon decks that I've seen, or Lovecraftian decks. So this one is a single uniquely in my mind, so it makes it, other than the graphical representation of it, of the three people leaning over the cauldron, the reminiscent of the Macbeth scene with the three witches. This is very unique, very beautiful, and it means some kind of reunion with an aspect that you lost, and it doesn't usually mean the exact idea of temperance, where you're tempted by, where you are tried with something difficult. That would be possibly wrong to interpret it with, unless other cards in the cast show up to support that kind of idea. Well, of course, the devil here is chosen nicely. I don't have a conceptual problem with Cthulhu. He is the star of this universe. Everybody knows Cthulhu if they know no other god. Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth are the ones most spread, and the ones that were secretly worshipped by Abdel al-Hazred, the fictional writer of the Necronomicon grimoire. But despite Cthulhu being so alien, having so many features, despite him glaring as he's waking up from his slumber in the waters of Rylea, the island of eternal sleep, despite all of that, my personal devil would be different in the Lovecraftian universe. I cannot find a more dark and sinister figure than the demon god Ganotha. And to me, Cthulhu looks just laughable compared to Ganotha, but that's to each his own personal devils, right? So, this Cthulhu image is definitely worthwhile. We see the octopi-like features. This upper part is somewhat now, in my mind, influenced by modern cinema. I think of the pirate Jack with his little crab-like features, and he has those wings on top that end up in a curved part. Very interesting. The fact that he stands in waters is also interesting. It's appropriate for the devil figure, where he is divided between several elements. There's a conflict, which is what is used to be able to tempt you. So I think it's lots of fun. Cthulhu is done well. His green body is... it seems more solid, I would say. I think the book describes it as being coalesced from being translucent, and if that is the power of Cthulhu to resemble himself so greatly, then that is some significant power, because I don't see the translucence on the card, I see only the solidity, so it must have taken him a very short time to group himself together, but I'm sure he was patient in the process, because he was waiting for eons to wake up anyway. Of course, Cthulhu has composite features, and there is the octopus features, there's maybe some kind of a bat wings. All those elements, again, they are reminiscent of the Lovecraftian concept of composition, of different mythologies, of different ideas, of different names into a single entity, where they become unrecognized from what each one of the elements used to be before. It's a sort of alchemical blend, if you will, that works so well in horror, where it used to be recognizable and then it becomes something new in a new way. That's really remarkable. And Cthulhu is really well crafted. His scale can be established by contrast to enormous pillars, and his height dwarfs many of them. So he is appropriate. He is the face of the Cthulhu mythos, of course, and he is done well to represent it. The next card is the Tower. I personally think that the Tower might have been one of the cards that could have inspired Stephen King, despite he doesn't list it officially as an inspiration, because I don't think he wants to alienate his mainstream readers, or maybe he does it even unconsciously, but I feel that the Dark Tower might have been inspired by the Tower card. It seems really to make sense, especially with the Dark Tower trying to collapse. And that's the thing, we usually see the Tower card on the verge of collapsing. Here, it seems so stable at the foundation, and yet the upper part of it is almost unraveling at the thunderbolt bolt that's flung at it. Normally, the Tower seems to collapse on its own in many traditional decks. Here, this great ziggurat is what is called, and it seems to be the result of an action, possibly a summoning. I would consider it possibly related to other events where certain entities, such as, say, Yog-Sothoth, is summoned to achieve a certain goal, and maybe the ritual is going wrong. So here there's an element of somebody, again, contriving to bring their own downfall. The Great Ziggurat here is based, of course, on the famous ziggurats of Uruk, which Lovecraft reinterpreted sometimes based on mythological tradition as the city of Iram. And you would know this city as the one that Abraham comes from, maybe, where such a dreadful god that requires the sacrifice of Isaac lives, that almost tricks Abraham into doing it, which biblical scholars consider to be a representation maybe of Moloch, but I'm thinking that Baal would make much more sense personally. But then again, maybe I'm biased by the Roman historians, I don't know. They would write about Carthage and its practices, and it's just so stuck in my mind. At any rate, here we see the tower the foundation being firm. It's not accidental, because the tower in many decks connects to the theme of foundation. You would know the Kabbalistic idea of foundation of the world, is how the sphere of foundation, also known by the Hebrew word yesod, comes into being. So the foundation is firm, but the upper part that's related more to the spiritual realms is collapsing. Also reminiscent of the Kabbalistic idea, again, not randomly, not accidentally, of how there was the Tower of Babylon and how it came into destruction by the will of the Supreme Lord, which in the Lovecraftian universe would definitely be typically ascribed to an elder god who was summoned by weaker magicians. They could not control him, he gets angry, he punishes them, and that's the result of the punishment. And it's well balanced between, again, foundation and the tip. The foundation is stable, the tip is destroyed, and it is that kind of a balance that might play a significant role in a reading where you have to build a greater foundation for, say, a project that you're trying to achieve, and not aspire too high before it's ready, type of thing, because that would be the result. It's kind of vivid to remember what the result could be like if you're asking if you should try this, that, or the other. Just maybe don't take it as in destructive terms as it might seem. Just because the tower is usually on the verge of collapse does not mean that you would be radically punished for not being prepared, but it's good to take into account that it might not go your way as you expect in a reading. The next card, Ishtar, is of course the star. Ishtar even means, in more than one language, it is traceable to the word for the star itself as we know it, the English word. Ishtar, of course, is the goddess of love in Babylonian pantheon. As such, she might represent the constellation of Venus, it seems appropriate. Here we have a strange interplay between Venus and Sirius. Sirius represented by this little Sirius dog, and the inclusion of Sirius is somewhat strange maybe in Lovecraftian terms, but if you remember, some of the myths even ascribe the origin myth of certain Native American tribes to the planet Sirius, and that maybe Lovecraft was aware of those and did something similar, and he always talks about the stars, then it kind of makes sense to include it. Here it's a different take on the traditional star motif. Usually we see the star as a guiding star that you reach for, that inspires you maybe, and we see a woman reaching for the star usually. But here it appears to be more on the verge of distracting star, because the woman is reaching here for the star while the dog is sensing the real danger ahead. So this kind of an interplay, you might want, if you're doing a reading with this deck, pay attention to it. It would give you a slightly different aspect of the star. It would give you the possibility of being distracted by a fake promise of a project and the real danger ahead and how you have to pay attention to it. And with that card immediately following the one before it, with the idea of the tower collapsing, if they come up together at any rate, it would be worthy to pay attention to what could happen in the future, how your project would probably not be realized and you are under an illusion. But otherwise, if you think this is a traditional card, it's slightly different. So the dog would show up more on the full card, so if you're trying to just go automatically, you might overlook that little detail. Then we have the Hounds of Lang, the card of the moon. The Lang, of course, was established in Lovecraftian fiction and might have been based on a similar plateau established in previous horror writers that inspired Lovecraft, or some would say sci-fi writers, because their horror was to an extent less horrifying and more alien and spacey based and futuristic than horror. So in Lovecraft, Lang is an imaginary plateau in Central Asia, where all kinds of strange things could take place, probably Lovecraftian, with horror involved. But here we have specifically the Hounds of Lang, and they are supposed to unconsciously feel some kind of a danger. And then the booklet that I have shown you previously shows that the danger implied underneath the hounds, in the grass and the atmosphere and the city above, is even more significant. So with that in mind, even though it's not, to me at least, as obvious on the cards, and probably not to Tyson himself because he thought it worthy to mention, that this is some kind of an instinctive implied threat underneath even the visible threat. So in a reading that could entail something like, okay, you see some kind of like reason for why things are not happening, but if this card comes up, that it could mean that there are also unconscious reasons or less visible reasons for why things are happening that are hidden underneath the ones you do see. So if, for example, you're breaking up with a boyfriend and the boyfriend breakup seems like really bad, there will be something underneath that breakup. Maybe you are sabotaging yourself, or the boyfriend is sabotaging himself on such a great scale that the fact of the breaking itself, even though it seems significant, is really just a symptom of a greater disease that really needs to be healed quickly. And hopefully you're good with your boyfriend because there are two hounds, so maybe it's like more promising actually, but just good to pay attention to. And of course, appropriate for the card of the moon, this represents the instinctive knowledge, much like the High Priestess who felt the instinctive knowledge from above and was trying to use it in mundane life. So it would represent something that you might not consciously know or notice, or even deem important if you do notice, but it is there and it is present on you, and this card will let know what exactly it is. Then we have the card, the Empty Space, representing the card of the sun. It seems appropriate. It corresponds to the traditional ideas of the sun, where it stands out above the ground, as is appropriate for the sun. The sun could represent inner forces. Here, the inner forces, through an act of magic, were possibly manifested in this outer force of the whirlwind that's fallen the poor guy, that possibly had something to do with raising it from the dead or summoning it or manifesting it, as magicians always try. It seems to correspond indirectly to the idea of Aemon in this universe. Whether solid or not, it works with this card, because Aemon was also the god of the wind in the desert, different periods of Egyptian history. So when they come together, you should pay attention to that. The fact that the monster has a whirlwind might mean something like an unpleasant change taking place in what you're doing, or your routine being disrupted and you feel unpleasant about it, even if it is for your greater good, or something that started earlier a long time ago is coming back to you. So the empty space is where things happen without your knowledge unconsciously, and that's appropriate for the Sun card. And of course, another good rendition here. The card of Judgment is often represented by this burning angel that bars your gate to heaven, and that part is also represented here, but again in an appropriately Lovecraftian fashion, where the angel in question also has a cyclopean-like eye at the center of his forehead, and there are other cyclopean hints here. You can see this throne on a bridge, and the throne has, I think, also a cyclopean one eye on top of it. So there are those Medusa Cyclops associations that bring us to the story of maybe Medusa and Poseidon in mythology. In Lovecraft himself, it has to do with those coils of Medusa, a story where he reinterpreted Medusa as an alien creature, being a hybrid between the Old Ones and humanity. So all of those associations are to be taken into account when discussing the card of Judgment, and the fact that some kind of an action brought the judgment on to you. So it's not random, it has meaning, it has purpose, but you don't like that meaning, that purpose. If you remember the idea of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve eating the apple and being punished for it, whether or not you agree with the God or consider him arbitrary and whimsical, that would be in principle what happens when some kind of an action caused a chain reaction, and that's its result, where this dire-looking angel is descending onto your heads to remind you of what you have done and how unwise it was. And that could be where the Medusa association comes to, where supposedly Athena punished her for a sacrilege as a priestess in the temple. But it seemed to have worked in part in Medusa's favor, where she started standing out from the rest of ordinary humans, was respected by them. So that is also a positive note in the Judgment card, where after you actually accept the punishment, then its nature could change and start working in your favor as a blessing instead of a curse. The card that concludes Major Arcana is suitably the serpent god Yig, who has the cosmic egg in his coils. This is a motif typical for many mythologies. You know, of course, of the Orphean myth of creation, where there's the cosmic egg that brought the universe into existence. There was an Egyptian egg myth. There were several others too. Once again, it's a composition of several myths into a single one, because Yig is more reminiscent of the serpent rainbow god of the Native American tribes than of any of the other mythologies mentioned, usually with the egg. Even look at his iridescent colors as he coils around the egg. Some theories tie him to the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl because of the sun associations with the rainbow serpent. But it's not as obvious usually. I think he is a composite image of several serpent gods and several creator gods. It's appropriate that the world has him because his role is always significant. He's always mentioned as one of the older ones. And um, it's good to keep in mind the balancing factor between the world and chaos as represented by the Fool. So the final card and the initial card are in opposition to each other. And Yig also is named very nicely. Those things that we meet again and again in Lovecraftian naming, they are also interesting. Yig and Yog and Yugos as the planet of the prospect for Pluto planet, they all have that YG. It has been traced linguistically in modern language terms to possibly the word Wig, the Germanic word for war, but it might have other associations too, and every time Lovecraft uses it, he always makes it sound sinister enough, and I always admire that. This card is appropriate. It shows how the creation itself, represented by the egg, is constrained by the possibility of destruction, because if the serpent becomes agitated, the egg could crack easily. So it's that, again, balance between chaos and power, and beautiful colors done to represent both of them. His coils and the egg itself even seems luminescent somehow, instead of just a simple egg, which is appropriate for an egg that represents the entire cosmos, possibly. So very well done. And I think I will stop here in the discussion, the major detailed discussion, because it has gone on enough. But maybe I'll just show you briefly all the minor arcana cards without expounding on them, except that they are part of the stories that are worth reading in Donald Tyson's other works. And that, appropriately, the water element represented by cups is tied to the goddess Bast that we have seen as the High Priestess and always lies under her influence and has her always implied in the background. And that is because the moon, which she symbolizes in part, always guides those instinctive powers of consciousness that the water element seems to speak about. Really beautiful pictures all around. Every element, I couldn't complain. It's always entirely gothic. It's always, well, usually at least it's Lovecraftian. Sometimes it seems like harmless people without any monsters, but there's often something sinister because of the gothic shades. Here we see one early example of Bast showing herself with her cat-like head. Another example of Bast in the statue, and there are many more. Really, I noticed Bast shows up again and again, so it is well connected. It is wonderfully done, and very nice deck. Donald Tyson again delivered. He is a solid researcher, and he did Lovecraftian universe very well. He knows a lot about it, and the deck really shows it. One of the better Lovecraftian decks I've seen. Yeah, there's definitely that suit tells some kind of a story, just like Tyson says. And even though it is described, sometimes I enjoy just mentally envisioning, oh, this might be this famous symbol that is mentioned in the Necronomicon, or at least one of them. But it's just like very interesting to imagine what could possibly be happening, and sometimes that's how I get good inspiration for my card readings. What could be happening, not what is happening, even because I cannot always know, but what could be happening. It's a very good question to stimulate the creative juices. and sometimes I get more ideas and understandings in addition to the text when I read it in the booklet. Okay, now we have reached the end of the minor arcana as well. So, I hope you enjoyed this detailed review of the Necronomicon deck by Donald Tyson and Anne Stokes. It's highly recommended. It might have grim scenes, but it can be used in several readings. I know how to, and I showed you how to use it positively. So if you have any further questions about this deck or the Necronomicon, feel free to leave a comment and like this video and share if you feel like it. And until next time, Batweb Gothic Reviews departs.